And the next story I'm going to tell you, I did not realize until we started putting this show together how many echoes there are between my grandmother's story and this one. But if you're listening, I think you'll notice. And it's really almost spooky. So a number of years ago, I was watching television with my mother, and there was an item on about the refugee crisis in Europe and the camps in Calais and Dunkirk. And my mother said, "I don't know why you don't go and volunteer there. There's nothing stopping you." And the voice in my head said, "It's not like you have a husband or children." My lovely mother would never say anything like that, but the voice in my head has no compunction. But afterwards I went, she's right. There is nothing stopping me. So I got in touch with my friend Audrey, who was living in Paris at the time. And at that stage, she was volunteering nearly every second weekend. And she told me how to sign up to volunteer. So I did that. And I made a plan to go the following September. And I started fundraising, and people started sending me equipment to bring over. And then it came to a week before I was meant to be going, and Jean said to me, "Are you nervous?" And I went, "I'm absolutely terrified." And she said, "I knew it. Usual. You've bitten off more than you could chew." So Jean did something she's never done before or since. She told the college where she works, "Don't expect me back for the first week of term." And the two of us packed up my trusty Volvo and took the ferry over to Calais. And there we arrived at this refugee camp where there were dozens and dozens of tribes and thousands of people going through the worst days of their lives. And it was one of the most heartening experiences I've ever had, because in the middle of that chaos and crisis, most people bore up with so much kindness and dignity. They took care of each other, but also they built a mosque and a church, very makeshift, and made a little football pitch for the kids. And they even, somebody was growing flowers in a cigarette carton outside their tent. And every night they would go and try and get on the trucks to go to the UK, which was the promised land. And if they failed, they'd come back and live another day. And our job as volunteers was primarily to keep the camp clean. If somebody did make it onto one of the trucks, we'd then have to get all their bedding and camping equipment and clear that up. But it was also just our job to pick up rubbish and make sure that there wasn't an outbreak of disease in the camp. And it was dirty and backbreaking work. But sometimes we could bunk off. And we'd be like, "We're going to volunteer at the school." So the school was just this little open air patch of scrub, but there were a few rickety out chairs and tables there, and some books and some copybooks and pencils. And that's where the men and boys, Calais was just for the men and boys, would go who wanted to improve their English. And people like Jean and me, who have a little teaching experience, could go and help them along. And that's where I met Carlos. So Carlos was just 16. He was from South Sudan. He had been separated from his family since he was 7. He knew that his mother had died, but he didn't know what had become of the rest of his family. But he'd made it this far by himself. And he was a really sweet kid and really diligent about his studies. My heart really warmed to him. And one time we were working together, and I noticed his footwear is really inadequate. He was wearing these cheap foam runners that were falling apart. And I said to him, "You need a proper pair of boots. Show me your shoe size." So I got his shoe size, and I said, "I'll go to the town and get you some boots." And I said, "While we're at it, do you need anything else?" And he didn't know the word for it, so he stood up and he lifted up his T-shirt to show me. His jeans were held up by a piece of string like Huckleberry Finn. I said, "Yeah, we can do a bit better than that." So I went to the town and I got him boots and a belt and some T-shirts and socks. And when I came back, I slipped them to him and we resumed our work. But I thought he looked a little tired, so I said, "Take a break there for a minute." And I went for a walk around. And when I came back, I saw he was still writing in his copybook, helped by Mohammed. Mohammed was this beautiful young man, just 24, but he took care of everyone. He was particularly like a big brother to Carlos. And I thought, look at him there, he really wants to learn. He's such a good boy. But when I sat down again, he slipped the copybook over towards me And in it he'd written, with Muhammad's help, "I will never forget you." And I held his hand for a moment and I thought about how little I'd done to deserve that. But I thought, okay, well, if he knows that not all Europeans fear and hate him, you know, just because of this, then I guess I've done what I came here to do. But it was really hard to leave when it came time to leave. And it was particularly hard to part from Carlos. And impulsively, as we were saying goodbye, I said to him, "Do you want a phone? Will I get you a phone?" And he looked at his feet and he said something in his language. And Muhammad put his arm around him and he said, "He doesn't have anyone to call." And all the way home on the ferry, I just kept thinking about that. And it wasn't just how ineffably sad it was, but all I could think was, like, what a sweet and diffident person he is. And I was like, you know, if there's a queue, that boy is going to be at the back of it. He's got no hustle. He could have said yes, please, to a phone, and then he could have charged other people to make phone calls, or he could have traded it for something, but he's just not grasping like that. And I thought, I do not know how he is going to survive this situation. So I couldn't bear thinking about him and everyone else I'd met there being alone, and the only thing that made it bearable was to sign up to go back again a month later. But that was in October, and right before I was meant to be going there, I got a message from the volunteer organisation saying, "Don't come. All the volunteers are cancelled. The French government is bulldozing Calais." So I don't know if you remember this, but the French government decided to bulldoze the camps in Calais and Dunkirk. And in Calais, what they did was they took everybody over 18 and they dispersed them around France, but they left all the unaccompanied minors there, 2,000 of them. The Guardian said it was like Lord of the Flies. I don't know what was going on. My best theory is that the French government was playing chicken with the UK government, saying, well, they all want to come to the UK, so come and get them. And the UK government was like, they're not my problem. So they were just stuck there. So I rang Audrey and I was like, "Audrey, I have to come back. I have to get into the camp. Carlos is there." And she went, "Oh no, listen, there's absolutely no point." And she said, like, they're only allowing on 30 volunteers a day into the camp to bring food and water, and only the most experienced and the most hardened volunteers, which, let's agree, you're not. And I said, "Well, I'd like to see them try to stop me." And she said, "Okay, well, I have 2 words for you: tear gas." Because the French security force have been very liberal with their use of tear gas. We'd been tear gassed more than once while we were in the camp. And yes, it will stop me in my tracks. But then I said, "But I have to find Carlos and make sure he's okay." And she said, "And if you came here and if you got onto the camp and if you found Carlos, then what's the plan? You have no plan here." And she said, "Honestly, love, you need to take a hold of yourself. If you were to come here now, you wouldn't be any help. You would need help." And I hung up the phone and I knew she was right. And all I could think was, I've made all the wrong decisions in my life. Like, if I had a husband and children, I'd have a family home and I'd be able to bring him here. I'd have something to offer him, and instead I'm completely useless. And that was a really dark thought. But then a few things happened. The first thing that happened was that the amazing Irish activist Caoimhe Butterley called for a candlelight vigil outside the Dáil to put pressure on the Irish government to take 10% of those 2,000 boys, just 200. Surely we can take 200. And I went along to that vigil. I was like, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. But astonishingly, 2 Irish TDs, women, sponsored a bill that was passed, and it was announced that Ireland was going to take 200 of these. The next thing that happened was that under international pressure, the French government took those 2,000 boys and now put them in different camps all around France. But as they moved them, they gave each one of them a mobile phone. And Carlos ended up in Biscarrosse on the Atlantic coast of France, but now we were in contact with each other. And the third thing that happened was that my friend Mary Nugent rang me, and she said, hey, Mary Kate, your sister Sarah was telling me about this kid you met in Calais that you want to help. And she was like, we'll take him. And I said, what? She said, yeah. She said, we already applied to be a foster family to a teenager. We're all set up. We'll take him. And I said, would you really do that? And she said, absolutely. She said, you tell that boy that I have room in my home and I have room in my heart for him. And I thought, I've made all the right decisions in my life because that woman's my friend. So I wrote to Carlos and I said, would you come to Ireland instead of going to the UK? And he said, do they have good schools in Ireland? And I said, yes, we have good schools in Ireland. You can get an education. So now my job was just to find out who was drawing up this list of the 200 boys that were coming to Ireland and how was I going to get his name on it. So I started door-stopping TDs and writing to ministers and calling everyone, but I could not find my way through this bureaucratic morass. Like the Department of Foreign Affairs said, that's nothing to do with us, it's to do with the Department of Family and Social Affairs, and they said, oh, we've never heard of that, we don't know what you're talking about. So I was pulling my hair out trying to figure this out. And now it's coming on Christmas. So I said to Carlos, I'll come and see you in Biscarrosse. I'll just come for a day or two. And I said, do you need anything? Do you want me to bring you anything? And he said, yes, I lost the boots that you got for me when we were transferred from Calais. And I was like, okay, I will get you a good pair of boots. So I got him a nice pair of boots and I booked my flights. And I was writing to the head of the camp, but he never responded. So eventually I just wrote and said, okay, I'm coming on this day, expect me. And then I was meant to be flying on the 23rd of December. On the 22nd, I'm doing my Christmas shopping. I'm on Grafton Street, and I get a call from a French phone number. And it's this gendarme, and she's from the Prefecture of Biscarrosse. And she's saying, I've got this information that you're coming to see this boy in the camp. And I said, yes, that's right. And she said, may I ask who you are to him? And I was like, I'm just a volunteer who met him like in the camp a couple of months ago. And she said, yeah, we can't give you permission to come and visit him. And I said, oh, why not? And she said, look, the camps are difficult to manage. And a bunch of the boys have just been told that their applications to go to the UK have been rejected. And they've been having big protests. And there's a lot of unrest. One boy even just walked into traffic in an attempt to end his life. So we're just trying to keep a lid on the situation here, and we can't have people coming in and out. And I said, okay, I understand that your situation is really difficult, but you have to understand that I made a promise to this boy. Don't make me break my promise. And I said, could you speak to your boss and just see, could I get like an hour with him, just a supervised visit in somebody's office? I just need to hold his hand and look him in the eyes and tell him I have not forgotten him. And she said, okay, I will do that. So that night, I was having dinner with my friend Morris, and I got a call back from the gendarme, and she said, yeah, no chance. She said, don't come. There's no point in you getting on this plane tomorrow. We cannot allow you to see him. And I said, okay, well, you have to go and find him and tell him that that's your decision and not mine. And she said she would do that. But then I thought, I can't leave it to her. I don't even know if she'll get a chance to do it. I have to tell him myself. So I rang him to say that I couldn't come. And he said, it's okay, it's okay. And he said, but look, here's the thing. They treat us very badly here. We're very unhappy. And I know that you want to help me, but you haven't been able to. So my friends and I are going to run away from Biscarrosse. We're going to go back to Calais and try to get on the trucks to the UK. And I said, you absolutely cannot do that. And I was like, you don't understand the difference between getting to Ireland legally and getting to the UK illegally. And he was like, but we have to try, we have to go. And I said, no, but there's no camp in Calais. Like, you're going to be in ditches in December in northern France. Your phone's not going to work. You're not going to have a charger. I was like, you cannot do this. And he was saying, yes, but I have to. And I was crying and he was crying and Morris was having a brilliant evening. But when I finally got off the phone from Carlos, Morris said, look, I haven't wanted to get involved in this because it's your crazy deal, but I might know somebody who can help you. And I was like, who could help me? He said, so I know this guy, he's the senior social worker for unaccompanied minors in Ireland. And I said, he might be, connect me with him. So the next day, Morris connected us by email. And Thomas, this guy, took time out of his really busy schedule and he rang me. And he said, okay, Mary Kate, let me explain to you what's happening here. The Irish government has passed this bill to say that we're going to take these 200 boys. But what has to happen next is that the Irish civil servants and the French civil servants have to agree terms for that transfer. And that's going to take weeks. And the weeks will turn into months. And the months will turn into years. And eventually, all the boys will be over 18. And we'll say, oh, well, we tried. The reason you cannot find the list is because there is no list. So I said, thank you. That clarity really helps. And I hung up the phone and I started making plans to smuggle him. So the first thing that I realized was that my Volvo wasn't going to be up to the job. And I said to my sister, Rachel, I need to buy a camper van. And Rachel was like, are you sure the Volvo wouldn't work? Like, it's a fine big boot, and if you crack the seats and the windows. And I was like, it's a 13-hour ferry ride. Like, I can't take the risk that I would suffocate him. And she said, well, why don't we do a trial run with me? It's not illegal. Then it's not illegal for me. I'll have my passport with me. And like, if we get caught, we'll just say we had an argument and you put me in the boot for a punishment. And I said, I love the support, but I'm not willing to take the chance that I would have to tell your children and husband that I've accidentally suffocated you. So no, I was like, it has to be a camper van. So then I told my friend Tanya. Tanya knows a thing or two about how the world works. And she said, And she said, yes. And she said, I don't think even if you get caught, I don't think they'll prosecute you. And I said, good. And she said, well, they might prosecute you, but you won't get a custodial sentence. And I said, good. And she said, but wait. And she said, I want you to think about it, because I know that a lot of your work and a lot of your friends are in America. So if you get even a non-custodial sentence for people smuggling, you'll never be able to go to America again. And I thought, I sure do love going to America. His whole life, like, there's no question, I'm doing this. So then I told my sister Rebecca, I think I was waiting for somebody to say, don't be ridiculous. But instead, Rebecca said, Mary, remember all those stories we grew up on about the Second World War? All those books and all those movies, and you always ask yourself, what would I have done if I had been alive then? She said, this is their Holocaust. Go and get them. These are the women of my tribe. But before I could close that deal on the camper van, I got another call from Thomas. And Thomas said, Mary Kate, I was completely wrong. We are going ahead with this mission, and I've just been put in charge of it. And he said, I just had my first conversation with my French counterpart, who said, okay, so we need to start making a list of the names of the 200 boys that we're going to send to Ireland. And Thomas said, 199. I have one already. So a couple of months later, Thomas had to go to Biscarrosse with a Garda to interview Carlos. And he rang me and he said, is there anything you want to send over? And I said, yes, I've got this pair of boots that I'm trying to get to him. So I went into Thomas's office and I was sitting in reception, and Thomas came out like this. And I was like, oh, are we hugging? Because we hadn't met. It had been all phone calls and emails up until then. And Thomas said, Mary Kate, do you think in my job I ever see happy stories? You bet we're hugging. You bet. And he rang me from France that night, and he said, thank you for finding Carlos. What an extraordinary young man he is. What a gift to Ireland he's going to be. And so a couple of weeks later, on March the 13th, I wish I could tell you it was March the 17th, but it wasn't. It was March the 13th. Carlos got on a plane for the first time in his life and came to Ireland. And he lived in a group home for a few months. And then he went to live with Mary Nugent. And he became a part of her family. These days, he calls me Auntie. I call him Habibi. But he said to me a couple of years ago, Auntie, ever since you met me, you loved me like a mother. Why did you do that? And I said, I don't know, Habibi, I don't know. But sometimes I think the reason I'd never had children was so that when you needed me, I'd be there for you. But I said to him, I know I hijacked you. You know, I know you wanted to go to the UK. And I said, you know, but when you get your Irish citizenship, you would still be able to go and live there. You know, there's a lot more of your countrymen there. And he said, no, the UK didn't want me. Ireland wanted me. I will be an Irishman. And just like that, my tribe got bigger by one, but infinitely dearer and more valuable and more precious to me.